Amazing. All right. Well, hi all. I'm Dr. Bernadette Bird-Bowen, as Michelle mentioned. And as you can see, today I'll be talking to you about a critical media ecological take on disabilities. And I like to start by at the beginning of all my talks, I like to say, okay, who are you? Because I feel like ultimately for me, that informs all of my work. And as I was just, speaking about with Michelle a moment ago, it informs everything that we do, whether we like to acknowledge that or not. So ultimately, for me, I'm a millennial, so I was born and raised with the internet. That informs a lot of my work, but also my lived experiences. I was born and raised in Chicagoland, which also informs a lot of my work and lived experiences. Like a lot of my early work was related to environmental injustices and racisms. But personally, my dad worked at BP Amoco. If y'all are familiar with the BP refineries, and my mom, unfortunately, in 2017, was diagnosed with lung cancer because of the things that BP Amoco does and the poisons that were brought home on his clothes from work. And she passed in the first year of COVID, but I'll get into that more later. But that intricately relates to all my work. Oh yeah, I'll get into that in just a second. Good question, Kelly. And I'm a born and raised punk kid, as many people in Chicagoland are. That informs a lot of my work as well. And again, it's more so the idea of using my lived experience as a form of knowledge, but seeing norms and saying, okay, are our norms benefiting society, or are there things that can be changed to benefit us even more? Relatedly, I'm also a non-binary neuroqueer person. I know y'all may or may not be familiar with either of those terms, but it means that my experience of gender doesn't fall into binary ideas, and I'm a late and left realized autistic person. So I didn't know that for my first 30 years. It relates to my talk today, so I like to be very upfront about that, especially now that I know at the age of 35, I learned about, give or take 5 years ago, because of the massive realizations about disabilities that haven't been known because of flaws of criteria and diagnosticians that I'll get in today in my talk. And it relates to my experience of gender because I'm femme presenting, but ultimately I'm very direct because of my autism, and I have a very distinct pattern recognition because of it as well. And it's influenced my entire identity throughout my entire life. And my educational background, I have a bachelor's in sociology, a master's in communication, and a PhD in meeting communication. As you can guess, that also influences all of my work because I learned about social problems that paired with my experiences of environmental justice and racism growing up. And it also influenced my knowledge of the way societies have been built and the way that language has been used to build those societies, getting into the media and communication PhD, which just further extended that knowledge. When I say, to answer Kelly's question, I'm an ex-academic, I used to be a professor before I became a program mentor here for the last 10 years. So I say ex-academic because I love traditional academia, even though, of course, I'm technically still a part of it with all of you right here, right now. And more particularly, as I promised in the little bio and description of this talk, I'm a critical media ecologist, which I'll talk about today, hence the name of the talk, A Critical Media Ecological Take on Disabilities. And most recently, I'm a TikTok content creator and author. So today, what I'll be TikToking to you about, if you will, is my research, what I've called the environment, the era since T19 has begun, and some takeaways. So in other words, you could say my research is the idea that we are fucking machines. And excuse my language, I mean it as a double entendre. You'll see what I mean in just a bit. The environment being why are we like this? And some takeaways, what can we do about it? Which is the title of my newest book that I published in January. So to get a little bit into this, my background, like I said, sociology, communication, media and communication. So I started out learning about the way society functioned, but inspired by all of my lived experiences. Because like I said, as an unrealized autistic person, unfortunately, I've suffered. I really have, and many of us have. As a white person, I've both participated and been at the receiving end of differing discriminations. But realistically, it informs all of my research. And as a critical academic in particular, I look at these things and I say, okay, how can we improve society? In my PhD, what I did, which I started in 2018, so halfway through is when COVID hit, if it gives you any idea of how it shaped me. I fell into a field happily called media ecology. Have you all ever heard of media ecology? Anyone in the chat?
Nope.
Oh, okay. I know I always like to see. So have you all ever heard of Marshall McLuhan? He's a
Nope.
famous Canadian media theorist. Okay. And thank you for your honesty. So it's a very niche field, but if anyone from Canada may or may not be in here, he's famous for this phrase, the medium is the message. And ultimately, media ecology is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for me, I've taken the traditional approach, which is focusing on media versus more of a content of a message kind of approach. And media ecologists say, okay, when technology is introduced into society or an ecology, if you will, it influences the entire ecology. So we look at technologies when they're being introduced and we say, okay, what's changed? What's happening? And in a traditional sense, they mean that just in, anything from the English phonetic language to a system of power, anything in between, mostly like media, like we'd think of like telephones or computers or the internet or algorithms, artificial intelligence. And what I've done with some colleagues since 2019 is created critical media ecology, where we've added critical cultural studies into the field. Because unfortunately, a lot of my main question in my work, why are we like this, stems back to looking at the fact that these institutions and these fields, if you will, a very colonial kind of way of describing it, have biases that are built in because of the way the foundation of nations have been built. So, with that said, before I get deeper into that, the four or really three main tenets, the fourth one is more of a critical understanding. My three main tenets of critical media ecology are we only know what we know, everything becomes normal in repetition, and everything is connected. Because for me, it's not about being a traditionally elitist type of academic who like harbors knowledge and keeps the public from being able to access information. It's about making sure that people acknowledge, like we were getting at with Michelle earlier, that our lived experiences are a form of knowledge and that we can all tell stories to exemplify the ways that systems of power work. Because we're all born into a world that was here long before we got here. So our lived experiences should be acknowledged as a form of knowledge. So with that said, my research looks at this idea that we are fucking machines. And again, I mean that both in a relational sense, but also we have come to believe the human body is a machine. My research, specifically for my dissertation project, I looked at the global loneliness epidemic. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with that, but basically it's this idea that we're lonelier than ever, or so research says. So we've been experiencing, maybe y'all have heard the term male loneliness epidemic. That's actually a very like singular version of it. It's a lot more complicated than that kind of narrative that's been spread, makes it out to be. The research also indicates that we live, unfortunately, in a very violent society where violences are normal, they're pervasive, they're underreported, and they're undercriminalized. And we live in a society where technologies are sold to us as solutions for human problems. So, with that said, the way that I've approached, oh, actually, I skipped over one. The way that I've approached, like, okay, why are we like this? Because that's really what I'm getting at. Is like, how did we get here? That was what my dissertation is really like exploring. It's this idea that language builds our world. So, what I was getting at before about media being used and influencing society, we often forget that language is a media. We take it for granted, kind of like fish to water, if you could say. And we forget that, like I said earlier, we were born into a world that was here long before we got here. We have this foundation of colonialism that grounds everything that we are. And when I say that, what I mean is that we were born into a society for hundreds of years that has treated us as if we're individual actors who don't have influence on larger societies, in large part, which has ultimately, there's a theorist by the name of Max Weber, and their work is about rationality. It's this idea that with a colonial perspective that has been kind of catalyzed by capitalism, it has removed the heart from the mind. And it has ultimately pedestaled logic that's been associated with the mind And it's been associated with both masculinity and the construct of whiteness. Because if we're talking about the way language builds our worlds, and we're talking about the US context in particular, we're talking about a society where citizenship was based on a very limited idea of who is a full human. So I'm sure anyone who is disabled is going to get where I'm getting at with this. This is the foundation of our nation. The citizenship in the US was built on a very limited idea of maleness and a very limited idea of whiteness, both of which are social constructs. So when we think about citizenship and we think about who is seen as a full human, and we think about who is allowed to build societies, generally it's been the same folks. Enlightenment subject, if y'all have heard that. White cis man who's owned land and is able-bodied. This is ultimately the colonial background that our nation is built upon. And looking towards folks that have that kind of knowledge, that have a belief that they are full humans and that everyone else is dehumanized because they decided they can't even be full citizens unless they meet their criteria of humanness. It ultimately has led us to disconnect from our own bodies, because think about it, when you're superiorizing logic, you're ultimately, according to Weber and another theorist by the name of George Ritzer, who coined this term McDonaldization, which it's this argument that we've pushed the superiorizing of logic to such an extreme that it's bled into every aspect of our life. So small changes over hundreds of years that didn't seem like a big deal ultimately became a very big deal over a long period of time when we could see like the full gravity of what we've done. So this is to say those big changes that again have superiorized logic and the mind over embodied knowledge and feeling and emotion, they've built a very dehumanizing and ultimately like eugenics foundation that the nation was built on. And I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with what I mean when I say eugenics. And if, by the way, if you have any questions about any like terms I use, please do ask me in the chat because I want to make sure I'm being very clear. And I'm hoping later on we'll have conversation about like any questions you might have. But when I say eugenics, I mean a logic of ableisms, racisms, classisms, and cis heterosexisms. So ultimately, this was built on top of with capitalist logics. Because if you think about it, colonialism, it treats the whole planet like an endless list of resources that we can use to our heart's content. There was a logic called manifest destiny, y'all might be familiar with, where basically it was this belief that colonial figures could come to this land and just use everything to their heart's content, including, resources, including people, including all other beings. So ultimately what capitalism did is it put a price tag on all of that. And then over a very long period of time, until especially the 70s and 80s, that sphere, like that way of thinking and being and that lifestyle went globalized. And it's changed everything. So when we think about the real ramifications of this lifestyle, how did they go about doing that? They did it using language to build the world. The way that they did that is they made systems of education, ultimately, that act as a media in my critical media ecological perspective. So colonial logics became biased practices. Remember how earlier, just a minute ago, I mentioned manifest destiny, the belief that you can use every resource to your heart's content. That was built on top of with eugenics. That was built on top of with a superiorizing of logic over emotion. And then we come from a religious kind of authority into a more scientific one. That's where we get logics of objectivity and then a profitability. And as it just all kind of has a ripple effect. So all of these logics, these colonial capitalist logics, become practices through trainings of education, looking to canonical figures that all said, well, this is how the world works. Because practitioners are ultimately the people who have been taught that educational, that lifestyle, those logics and practices, and then their actions reveal those same biases, whether that's religious leaders, whether it's medical professionals, whether it's politicians, the list goes on. Because again, from a critical media ecological perspective, humans act as media in a society building process. And I say that both ironically, but also very literally, because when we think about the way that we exist in the world, we exist in a world that is ultimately running very machine-like. We've come to believe the human body is a machine, for better and for worse, because it's taught us a lot, but it's also forced us down paths of specialization. Think about it like this. Like if I was to zoom in my camera really, really close, you would see a really, really close-up image of my eye, but you would lose sight of the entire rest of the picture. And that's sort of what specialization does. Let me take a drink of water. So ultimately, we have a really, really good knowledge of something that's very specialized, but we lose sight of the interconnection of things. So with that said, because of the limited knowledge of these figures that have been built with these logics and practices, we have also lost so many other forms of knowledge because there's been missing humans, you could say, that has led to missing data. So if you're only humanizing one lived experience for most of human history, everyone else has quite literally been treated as if their experience is not a form of knowledge at all. And we see this by the same figures being pedestaled in canon. We see it in every institution, copy and pasted. That's my argument, and that's what the research that I've looked to shows. And I'll get into more specifics of this in just a bit. But a lot of people also don't know that when we're talking about human studies, the vast majority of participants, if you think about it, are actually traditionally college-age white folks, because most of folks running the studies are doing so at their college campuses that are disproportionately of that lived experience. And then that data goes on to be spread as if it is representative of the entire populace, when we know that that's not actually true. Hopefully y'all are picking up what I'm putting down. So ultimately, like I said just a second ago, I've called this phenomena the limited intelligence of our environmental intelligence, our relational intelligence, our algorithmic intelligence, what I've called environmental intelligence, the environment since COVID-19 started, like the environment influenced by the virus. So our knowledge about C19, as well as our knowledge about artificial intelligence, because every single one of these spheres ultimately has been built with those rotten eugenics foundations on top of, or with capitalism built on top, sort of, you could say, lubricating the gears, so to speak. So with that said, moving into the second part of the talk, the environment, as I just mentioned a moment ago, has broken down and broken through these very taken for granted logic and practices of our society. And they've revealed rotten eugenics foundations. Because oftentimes when we're in a society that's running, and many of us at least are able to live somewhat comfortably, we don't think about the things that norms put into place. We don't think about the logic and practice of our society because it's just everything, we only know what we know, everything becomes normal and repetition, and everything is connected. But what I found, and I know I've heard this from so many different lived experiences, is that since C19 started, everything has changed. I'm sure you all can agree with that in your own way. And ultimately, like in my work, the way that I've understood that, because remember, I was halfway through my PhD when COVID-19 started. So I moved to a new state to pursue my dreams. And I was working on a PhD studying the way language builds our worlds and the way medias alter our understandings of reality while watching knowledge about our world be deconstructed in real time on platforms like TikTok. And what I found is that, especially since 2020, it's led to mass realizations about identity, people realizing they're not who they always thought that they were because they were able to separate from norms. They don't want to be in relationships like they thought that they did, whether that means they don't want to be with the partner they were with, they don't want to deal with the violences that they were used to, if they could afford to leave, that is, which realistically not everyone can. Or they just realized they don't have a community like they thought they did. Because when you go through a time of crisis, it's going to show you who's really there for you. And ultimately, for better and for worse, as media ecologists always detail, what I've called the environment has allowed us to kind of reevaluate who we want to be, how we want to be in community, and whether or not we were being true and authentic to ourselves. And so this has led, especially to, like I said earlier, mass neuroqueer self-realizations. And I was a part of that, both personally and politically, while documenting it on platforms like TikTok. So what I found is that people are, especially folks assigned female at birth, they were coming out realizing that they don't identify as women, that they actually were autistic and were missed because the diagnostic criteria for autism, especially over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of literature that's come out that shows that the criteria for autism was built around a young white cis boy. So most of us have been missed and have been suffering in silence. And it also didn't even catch all the young white cis boys that it claimed to. So the criteria itself was just flawed because it was based on things that canonical figures could observe about someone with autism without acknowledging the experience, the internal feeling experience of what autism can really be in its multiplicity. And this is just one example. There's many, many things, ADHD included, but it's really because of when you have a virus that allows you to just think about health differently and disease differently, it kind of, again, breaks down the belief that people are just by default not disabled. And it forces us to come face to face with the reality of how complicated disability really is. So when I say that, that has been a beautiful thing because it's allowed us to kind of take an audit, you could say, about what our society has been, who we've looked to as authorities, whether or not they've been doing us a service or a disservice, and how we want to move forward. But simultaneously, it's also led us to acknowledge that going on 6 years of COVID-19 research is also being largely ignored by global governments. To not belabor this extensively, I very deliberately looked at science communication because remember, I don't approach this as a virologist. I don't approach this as an immunologist. I approach this as a media and communication scholar who studies ideas of norms, the way media builds our reality, and the way that we come to know things. And realistically, because of what I just explained a moment ago with why are we like this, I know that authorities have been built deliberately and equitably. I know that there's an authority gap. I know that media alters the way that we come to know reality. And what I watched, unfortunately, alongside many other experts and folks that are like trained in research processes, is research being ignored to this day that shows transmission of C19 et al. Causes cumulative full body damage. Even if you're fully vaccinated, even if you have a mild case, even if the case is asymptomatic, meaning whether you notice symptoms or not, especially with repeat reinfection, that you can get reinfected with more variants at the same time than many people think. Like you can be infected with one variant and then get infected with another. And that transmitting C19 at all, again, I can't reiterate this enough, can lead to the disability long COVID, of which currently there is no treatment beyond symptom management. The big thing about disabilities is that you are disabled whether you know it or not. And this is a moment in history where we're being faced with that more saliently than ever before. Because just like the mass realizations of autistic people who didn't know it, because you can only know what the authorities know. And no matter how clear it is that you live the symptoms of something, if you aren't given that information, you can't know. It's the same sort of situation. So just to expand a bit more, we know long COVID is a multi-system disability, and it has devastating effects on any organ system because COVID-19 attacks your mitochondria, which any good millennial knows is the powerhouse of the cell. It is why so many people are currently experiencing fatigue. So many people are experiencing endless damage after COVID-19 infections. And again, I won't belabor the research. All of this is copied directly from my new book. along with plenty of other resources from the last 6 years. But this is the type of research that's been ignored. So building on this, originally, I've been so excited to give this talk because last month I was supposed to actually give it. And in the meantime, something happened. So the reason why I wasn't able to give this talk last month is because I had, as you can see, wisdom tooth woes. So I'm 35. 10 years ago, I had my bottom two wisdom teeth out. I never thought the top two would ever come down. Last month, on the 6th, this one decided to show its head. So I couldn't ignore it any longer. Because of the fact that the biased logics and practices did not incline medical professionals to continue masking, I've been avoiding going to the dentist for now 5 years. I got lucky. I went right before COVID started. I haven't been since, until obviously I just got my tooth out like a couple weeks ago. But this put me in a conundrum, right? Where I was basically put in a situation where I wanted to either risk my health, knowing the research about COVID-19, in medical facilities where I know medical professionals are not properly following precautions for COVID, or continue suffering. And that Friday, I couldn't ignore it any longer. So I bring this story up because not only was that in itself exemplary of disabilities and my knowledge of disabilities, but it showed it even more. So the events that sort of played out was I attempted to get into an emergency dentist over that weekend. And I asked the medical professionals to wear masks. They rejected it. So I decided not to go. That night, I was like experiencing severe, severe pain. Like if anyone's ever experienced wisdom tooth pain, you know that it's another level of pain. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I tried to go back the next day. They said they don't take insurance on the weekends. I said, okay, let me, and they were like, oh, you can go to an urgent care and get antibiotics. And I was like, okay, let me go and do that. So anyway, I did that. Thankfully, they caught that I had a 99-degree fever because I woke up on Friday, I forgot to say this, with swelling that extended around the tooth to the back of my throat. So if it would have gotten further, it would have been really serious. So anyway, they caught the infection. I got antibiotics. The next day, I went to a dentist. They noticed that because of the infection, if anyone's gotten an infection of a wisdom tooth, you know that a lot of the time, if you have a periconditis, which is swelling of the, the skin and the, like your cheek and whatnot around the tooth, it's going to make it hard for you to open your jaw. It's called trismus. And ultimately, it would go away as the infection does. Okay, put a note in that for later. So ultimately, I went to the dentist and they noticed that I couldn't open my jaw wider than about a finger and a half, let's say, just for ease of access. So they didn't force my jaw open and they just took an x-ray of my mouth, They said, hey, your tooth isn't infected, it's just the skin around it. And then they gave me a referral to an oral surgeon. I looked for the oral surgeon. They weren't available until 2 days ago. And I said, I need to get this tooth out like as soon as possible. I'm in excruciating pain and I'm afraid that if I finish this trick of antibiotics, it's going to get reinfected. And I really don't want to deal with that because my wisdom tooth was poking out towards my cheek. So not only was it inflaming the infection further, but it was excruciating for me to even talk because I'd waited a very long time for this tooth prior to it actually fully exposing itself on that Friday. I'd been trying to ignore it. So anyway, this is to say I looked up other oral surgeons in my area. And I really, really wanted to see if I might be able to get a surgeon that was a woman, just out of curiosity. I looked for 60 oral surgeons, all of the surgeons in my network. 4 of them were women. I said, okay, let me try to call up some of their offices. All of them work with children or were not available. So anyway, I called another office. Luckily, there was a consultation that was canceled that day, and I was able to get in. I went. Not only were they not masked, they made a big deal out of it when I asked them to mask. And during the consultation, they said, okay, we're gonna need to like, he tried to open my mouth basically. And without asking, I opened my mouth as wide as I could. And he said, is that as wide as you can open it or as wide as you're willing to? And without asking, he forced my jaw open. And I was in excruciating pain. So I raised my hand to indicate to him that I am not consenting to this. In fact, please stop. But I couldn't because he was forcing my jaw open. Yeah. And for anyone that doesn't know, you don't do that when someone has trismus. My dentist that morning knew. Um, anyway, there was an assistant in the room that saw it as well. And she looked shocked. And he ignored me. He kept opening it. It continued being excruciating. He sat down and said, "You're going to want to be asleep for this." And I said, "I can't be asleep. It's just me. I have to drive myself home." And he said, "But I'm going to, I can't numb all the way down here." And remember, I've had my two wisdom teeth out 10 years ago. I know that you don't need to numb all the way down to here. So I was like, why would I need to do that? He tried to sell me on this drug called Exparel. If anyone's heard of it or not, it's a pain medication that's submerged in your jaw, like in the place where they do the extraction. And it lasts for about 3 days, makes a lot of money for the people who sell you that drug. In fact, his entire office does not do procedures, I came to learn, without that drug, regardless of whether it's necessary. So anyway, I was shocked as someone who has lived a life of violence realistically and just had my consent disregarded completely by this oral surgeon. Mind you, I didn't think I could afford another consult. I didn't think that I could, that I didn't think that something like this would happen to me, if I'm perfectly honest, after everything that I've learned. But that's what you hear from experts all the time who study systemic violences like this. We think that these things, like that we would be better able to advocate for ourselves. But I should know better than that. I know that things are more complicated. I know that I still have like a response to if someone disregards my consent like that. Anyway, I signed up after asking like more repercussions of this Exparel drug. And I wrote a letter about this experience to the Ohio State Dental Board. I wanted to read y'all a little of because it details the side effects of this medication that I think you might find really interesting. So again, this is a medication that this oral surgeon demands all of his patients take. And he doesn't disclose that before the consultations. It said, and this is a little pamphlet that they gave me. It says nausea, fever, headache, vomiting, constipation, low blood pressure, low number of red blood cells, muscle twitching, blurred vision, itching, and rapid heartbeat. It also details that this medication affects the nervous system and the cardiovascular system, may cause an allergic reaction, may cause damage if injected into the joints. It can cause a rare blood disorder. So another thing about autistic people is we have a very high list of comorbidities. This is why, on top of just the identity realization alone, it's of the utmost importance that people that are autistic are aware of it so that they can have that like triangulated knowledge of the fact that they're more likely to be susceptible to other types of vulnerabilities. And we all know as disabled people or allies to disabled people that medication is not one size fits all. And for this oral surgeon to not only force all of his patients to be on this medication with all these lists of risks is problematic in itself, but that it is representative of the rotten eugenics foundation that I detailed. So I wasn't obviously intending to tell this story originally, but since it happened, it was so relevant. And the way that I often deal with situations like this is by doing research. After experiencing this and writing the letter to the Ohio State Dental Board to make them aware of my complaint, I also did some research. Remember earlier how I said that in the search for an oral surgeon, I could only find 4 who were women. Well, it turns out this is representative of a larger contextual issue in the field of dentistry and oral surgery overall. I found a continuing dental education course by doctors Upgard and Rake from 2021, and they said that there are prevailing racial, ethnic, ability, class, and gender disparities in the field. In fact, I know many of us have probably heard of the term food deserts, but turns out there are many deserts in a nation built so inequitably. There are also dental deserts, meaning we know that only about 3.8% of practicing dentists are Black. We know that the vast majority of folks who get PhDs at all are not Black. They say less than 10% of PhDs are Black in general, so it's no surprise that this low of a percentage of dentists would be Black. We know that folks in dental deserts are more likely to be Black or brown. We also know that 94% of practicing oral surgeons are cis men. 94%. As of 2019, even though 34.5% were cis women, only 21% were specialized, and 8% of oral surgeons were cis women. That's a staggering statistic. So, think about it like this. The reason why I'm sharing this is because only because of my educational privileges was I able to even contextualize the experience that I just detailed, to understand why I experienced it. Detailing the way my lived experience is a form of knowledge. Most of the public, because again, only 2% of the global populace has a PhD. So a lot of us often do not have access to knowledge that is kept behind paywalls and other types of elitist institutions that don't allow us access to that knowledge. And also, I'm glad that you have a female dentist, Sherry. I also did before, the one who didn't force my jaw open. So I'm glad to hear that. We also know that if it's not the representation itself in the fields, it's the canon cited that have very biased logics, and their logics become practices. So for instance, what I mean is that if it's not the educational biases within the classroom leading to a lack of representation, which in the continuing dental education article that I read, Upgard and Rake detailed that anyone assigned female at birth in the classroom that they spoke to didn't feel comfortable. And they also explained that there's a myth in the field, in oral surgeon in particular, that prioritizes brute force over agility. They associate being able to extract a tooth with literal brute force. That's what's going to make you better at extracting a tooth. And it may just be a coincidence, let's say. But I would say, regardless of whether it's a coincidence or not, the experience that I had is representative of those biases. So with that said, when I say that disabilities and a critical medico-logical take on disabilities reveal challenges, I mean that the experience of disabilities reveals industrial challenges, eugenics logics and practices. It reveals the profit-centric and billionaire-owned experience of healthcare and health insurance. It reveals institutions and the barriers of accessibility. It reveals legislation like defunding Medicaid and the biases of legislators. Disabilities reveal diagnostic criteria that is biased and diagnosticians that were educated into biases that they take for granted. But it also reveals opportunities, because even though all of these things seem just as negative, if not more so than the prior slide, I think what's most important is to recognize that any challenge, just like COVID-19, broke down and broke through societal issues and eugenics biases. We have to see the current state of things as an opportunity and a need for change. So we know that there are unsustainable devastations happening because of COVID-19. The loneliness, the violence, the being sold technologies in place of human solutions I spoke to at the beginning. We know that many of us can't afford basic needs, especially if we're disabled, Black, or brown. We know that the society prioritizes profit over people. We know that themes of elitism, professionalism over a fuller embodied humanity, and establishment control is an opportunity to change. We know that carceral systems that police how our bodies need to be whether we are able to be disabled in public and outright with the institutions that we take part in, leads to inaccessibility. We know that profit centrism leads to disability. And we know that we need, because of especially, again, another thing besides my wisdom tooth woes that leads to a further insight on a critical medical take on disabilities, is it's abundantly clear that if Medicaid could be defunded to the amount that it just has, that we need genuinely fundamental changes. And that includes a new political system, that includes changes to miseducated and disinformed laws. Because the reason why you could defund Medicaid to the extent that they just have is because of a two-party system that disallows people to have their needs be met. And we know that the specialization of higher education goes on to train who becomes legislators, who becomes researchers, who becomes any other authority figure. And we know that it leads to reductive research, whether that's the participants, the findings, and the diagnostic criteria that comes out as a result. So this is to say, disabilities enable us to remember that we were born into a world that was here long before we got here, that we deserve better, that we all have inherent value, and that we need to enliven historical erasure in this time more than ever, I would argue, so that we can acknowledge what we actually deserve and build towards a liberatory future where we all actually have what we need to survive, especially those of us that are disabled, Black and brown. We know that everything that's been done, everything that's happening now, and everything that we can do in the future is a choice. Because humans act as media and society building processes. A lot of the time we talk about history as like it's an amalgamation of systems that just like acted on their own accord, forgetting that human beings were the ones that made those choices. As hard as it is to talk about these complicated and interconnected issues, liberation and building a society that allows us to all have what we need to survive, especially again, those of us who are disabled, Black and brown, is a necessary grieving process that is hard, but is also possible and worthwhile. And it's very, very clear now more than ever, again, I would argue, in the most connected humanity to ever exist, where we're seeing the crumbling of institutions, that we need fundamental systemic changes. Not only to regenerate our own humanity, to make our relationships less violent, but also to regenerate our relationship with the planet, to counteract the devastating effects of industrialism leading to the climate crisis. So what can we do about that? Ultimately, because of the level of disembodiment, the superiorizing of logic at the expense of emotions and embodiment, we need to reflect on our lives as a form of knowledge. Just like I explained with that story of wisdom tooth woes, things like that can seem like, oh, well, that's just a one-off incident. And it's like, when you look at the context, it becomes clear that that's not the case. And you can say that with just about any experience, really. Think about who you are. Think about where you've lived. Think about what you know. What do artists, activists, and academics say about your experiences? Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? Google the going on 6 years of publicly accessible C19 research, because all the research that I included in my whole book, I deliberately included because it's an easy Google search away to counteract the deliberately elitist and exclusive, keeping of knowledge. At the end of the day, it's of the utmost importance that we're documenting the disconnections that we're living and that you've noticed, because every one of us has unique knowledge from our lived experiences that are, again, unique to us. And we need to share the word about them. That's what's made TikTok so life-changing for so many of us. It's the largest platform that's ever existed. Billions of data points collected every day. That's why people say that the algorithm is so eerie and that it has like an eye into our subconscious, because it's collecting the most data ever. At the end of the day, though, technologies can't save us, because we need fundamental human problems require fundamental human solutions. And we all have different abilities to change things. So I think if we can, what time like the present? But more specifically, I think, and this is the final thing I'll say, what can WGU do about it? Based off of what I said. We know that high quality masks, air purifiers, and hand washing work to stop the spread of COVID-19. I think it's of the utmost importance that as an institution that very much champions doing non-traditional things, that we are not forcing in-person events to protect our community. I think it's of the utmost importance that if we have in-person events, that we provide high quality masks to attendees. I think it's of the utmost importance that if folks are going to have lunch or food at the events, that they're allowed to eat outside so that they're able to have at least more air exposure. And I think, and this is of course all radical expectations and recommendations, as someone that was a professor and is an autistic person, I was a professor the last 10 years. Especially in the first couple of years of C19, if my students asked for accommodations, regardless of formal documentation, I gave them to them. Because at the end of the day, with what we know about disabilities, we know that people are disabled whether they know it or not. If you have the power to grant those accommodations, what do you have to lose? Truly. Like, in a society that has been so disembodied and views disabilities as almost like it's been stigmatized for a very long time, almost as cheating. Accommodations are not cheating. Accommodations, people who ask for accommodations do so because they need them. No accommodation provided to a student or a faculty member or anyone else provides an unfair advantage because it's just leveling the playing field. If someone needs extra time, for instance, they're not asking because they wouldn't benefit from it. Like, find me one accommodation that wouldn't genuinely just help everyone and that can be implemented. Anyway, thank you for your time. I know I talked a lot, but I really, really appreciate you all. And if you have any questions or concerns, I'm more than looking forward to the discussion.